Thanks for watching this video. Unfortunately, I left my crown at home, and that would be perfect for this video, but that's okay. I'm going to talk a bit with you about King George III. Now, we read about King George III from our Journeys book when we read Can't You Make Them Behave, King George? And we remember that King George, his dad was the prince, and his grandfather was king. This was like years before he became king. And in our country, there's no such thing as kings. In our country, we elect our presidents, right? Well, back in the 1700s in England, you didn't elect who your leader was, right? You're the king, whoever the king is. And then when the king dies, his son takes over. When that guy dies, his son or brother, if they don't have a son, right? You don't get to vote for who your leader is. It's all based on bloodlines, family. The king, his son becomes next in line. Well, anyway, King George's grandfather was king. He was just a young guy, a kid. Well, all of a sudden, King George's father dies at age 41. And now young George is next in line. And he becomes king when George's grandfather finally dies. Now George, a young guy, becomes king. Maybe he's not quite ready yet. Well, anyway, young George becomes king, I think, at age 22. Yeah, he's 22 years old. And this 22-year-old George is very stubborn. Very stubborn. Doesn't like to listen to other people. He wants to be right, and anyone who disagrees is wrong, according to George. And this is the way it is for George. With Parliament, if anyone in Parliament disagrees with George, he gets very angry, right? He doesn't like to hear other opinions. And this is a big thing with the causes of the American Revolution. George is very angry at the colonists who are protesting all of his laws. George thinks that he's right, and he thinks the colonists have no right to argue and protest. Like the Stamp Act, for example. George thinks it's ridiculous that the colonists are protesting and boycotting. He thinks it's ridiculous. He does not like the fact that they have to repeal the Stamp Act. George does not repeal it because he thinks that the Stamp Act was wrong. He still thinks that the Stamp Act was the right thing to do. He repeals it because they thought it would cost too much money to enforce the Stamp Act. It would cost too much money to enforce it, to make the colonists continue to pay the stamp, to have soldiers policing the Stamp Act. It was costing the merchants a lot of money because the colonists were boycotting. King George thought it wouldn't make sense to have the Stamp Act lose money for England when the whole purpose of the Stamp Act was to get money for England for the debt, right? So he repeals the Stamp Act. And people in New York are so happy, they actually put up a statue of King George to thank him for repealing the Stamp Act. Well, of course, George didn't do it because he was trying to be nice. He did it because he wanted to save money, because the Stamp Act was actually costing England money. That didn't make sense. Anyway, because King George was so stubborn, he didn't listen to the colonists, and that was one of the reasons that we ended up having a war with England. Okay, so we've learned a lot about the different causes of the American Revolution. Today, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about King George, just to remind you about him. Thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. We'll learn more about the Boston Massacre, about who's to blame.